He laughed. That was the part Naomi Carter could never explain to anyone afterward. Not the betrayal itself, not even who it was with. It was the laugh. Deep, relaxed, the kind of laugh a man only makes when he feels completely safe. When he thinks no one who matters is listening. She stood frozen in the hallway of her own home, one hand pressed flat against the wall to keep herself upright, the other resting instinctively over her 7-month belly. And through the cracked door of Damien's private study, she heard her husband of 7 years laugh like a man without a single secret in the world, while her younger sister whispered something against his neck. If that were you, if you heard that laugh, what would you do? Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one don't find you by accident, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night Naomi Carter decided to disappear. She almost didn't go looking for him. That was the thing that would haunt her in the months that followed. The fact that she had almost just gone upstairs, poured herself a glass of water, and gone to bed like she had done 100 times before. She was tired. Her feet were swollen. Her back had been a slow, grinding ache since Tuesday, and the baby had been restless all day, turning and kicking as if she already knew something was wrong. But Naomi had seen the light under the study door. Damien was supposed to be in Milan. He had told her that morning, kissed her forehead, pressed his palm against her stomach, told her the trip would only be 3 days. She had packed him a bag herself, folded his shirts the way he liked, tucked an antacid in the inside pocket because he always forgot and always called her from whatever hotel at midnight complaining about indigestion like it was breaking news. So when she came downstairs for water at 11:15 and saw that light bleeding under the study door, her first feeling wasn't suspicion. It was relief. He came home early. That was her first thought. She was already smiling when she pushed open the hallway door. Not all the way, just enough to call out to him. And then she heard the voice. Not Damien's voice. Her sister's voice. Camille, 26 years old, honey-brown skin, a laugh that had always sounded too practiced, too bright, like something she'd rehearsed in a mirror until it came out perfect. The same laugh Naomi had listened to at every family dinner for the past 3 years since Camille had moved into the city and started coming around the mansion more often than anyone had thought to question. Naomi's hand stayed on the doorframe. She did not push it open further. She did not call out. She stood exactly where she was and listened to her sister say, in a voice so low it was almost tender, "She's never gonna know, baby. She's too busy playing doctor to pay attention to what's right in front of her." And then Damien laughed. That laugh. Naomi's hand moved to her stomach without her thinking about it. The baby kicked. One sharp, decisive movement. And for a wild second, Naomi thought, even she knows. Even this child, not yet born, not yet named, already pressing against the walls of her own small world, already trying to tell her mother something her mother did not want to hear. She did not make a sound. She stood in that hallway for 43 seconds. She counted them later, lying in the dark upstairs, staring at the ceiling with her shoes still on. 43 seconds in which every version of the life she had built, the late nights in residency while Damien sat in hospital waiting rooms refusing to go home, the miscarriage they had grieved together 4 years ago, the morning she had told him she was pregnant again, and he had put his face in his hands and wept like a man who had been handed something he didn't deserve. All of it moved through her mind like a film reel someone was pulling slowly through her chest. And then she walked away. Not because she was weak, not because she was afraid. She walked away because she understood, with the cold clarity of someone trained to make decisions while everything around them was falling apart, that the worst thing she could do right now was react. Surgeons don't operate on themselves. She had learned that in her first year of residency, from a professor who had the kind of calm that made you want to either trust him completely or be deeply afraid of him. When the situation involves you personally, he had told the room, your hands are the last hands you want touching the wound. She went upstairs. She took off her shoes. She lay down on her side of the bed, the left side, always the left, because Damien ran warm and she had spent 7 years unconsciously migrating toward the cooler half of their bed. And she stared at the ceiling and she did not cry. She was still awake when she heard him come upstairs 2 hours later. She heard him pause outside the bedroom door, heard him push it open slowly, the way he always did when he thought she was sleeping, that careful, almost gentle carefulness that had once made her think, This is a man who doesn't want to disturb anyone. She heard him cross to the bathroom, heard the water run, heard him brush his teeth, and then he came to bed. He slid in beside her, and she felt the warmth of him, familiar as anything she had ever known, and she kept her breathing slow and even. He moved toward her the way he always did in the dark, not reaching for her, just angling his body slightly in her direction, the way people do when they've slept beside someone long enough that proximity becomes its own language. She felt his hand settle lightly on her hip. "I know you're awake," he said quietly. She didn't answer. "I came back early," he said. "Couldn't sleep in that hotel." The lie was so smooth she almost admired it. Not a hesitation, not a roughness in his voice, nothing. 7 years, and he had apparently gotten very, very good. She said, "I know, I saw the light under your door." A beat, just one. Then, "I didn't want to wake you. You need your rest." "I'm fine," she said. "How's the baby?" She put her own hand over her stomach. "Active," she said. "She's been kicking all day." "Good," he said. "That's good." And then he was quiet, and after a while his breathing changed, and he slept. That easy, immediate sleep of a man whose conscience, apparently, was not keeping him up. And Naomi lay beside him in the dark and made the most important decision of her life. She did not decide to leave him. She decided to disappear. There was a difference. Leaving meant divorce papers, lawyers, custody battles, the full brutal machinery of a separation from a man whose name made federal agents cross themselves and change the subject. Leaving meant Camille winning. Leaving meant spending the next 18 years watching her daughter shuttled between two households, one of which was a mafia empire with blood on every wall, and fighting in courtrooms where the other side had enough money to make judges forget things. Leaving was a war Naomi could not win. But disappearing? That was different. Disappearing was surgery, clean, precise, decisive. You didn't fight the disease. You removed it entirely and closed the wound behind you. She thought about Dr. Elias Vance. She hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years, not since the dinner where Damien had made one of those quiet, polite comments that weren't really requests. "I don't think it's a good idea for you to stay close to men from your past, even mentors." And Naomi, who had been too tired and too accommodating and too convinced she was choosing her marriage over her pride, had allowed that distance to grow. But she still had Elias's number in a phone that wasn't connected to anything in Damien's network, a prepaid she had bought 2 years ago for reasons she had never fully examined until now. She had always told herself it was just practical, an emergency line, a habit left over from her years of working in hospitals, where the first lesson every resident learned was, always have a backup plan. Lying there in the dark with her husband's hand on her hip, Naomi understood that some part of her had known this moment was coming before she had let herself see it. She did not sleep. At 6 in the morning, when Damien's alarm went off and he rolled away to deal with the first of what would be many early calls, Naomi got up, showered, dressed, and made breakfast. She set his coffee on the counter the way she always did. She sat across from him and listened to him talk about Milan. The meetings, the deal, the late dinner that had run until midnight, all of it delivered with the ease of a man telling the truth. She watched his hands while he talked. Surgeon's habit. You could tell a lot about a person from what their hands did while they spoke. His hands were perfectly still. "You seem quiet," he said at one point, glancing up from his phone. She looked at him. Really looked at him, the way she hadn't in a long time, the way you stop doing when someone becomes furniture, when you stop seeing a person and start seeing a fact of your life. And she said, "I'm just tired." He nodded. His eyes dropped back to his phone. "You should rest today. Don't push yourself." "I won't," she said. He left at 8. He kissed her forehead at the door. He pressed his palm against her stomach and said something soft to the baby, something she could feel vibrating against her skin, even if she couldn't hear the words. And then he straightened up and looked at her with those dark eyes that had once made her feel like she was the only thing in a room full of everything. "I love you," he said. She smiled. "I know," she said. She watched the car pull out of the driveway. Then she went inside, picked up the prepaid phone from the back of her winter coat pocket in the hallway closet, sat down at the kitchen table, and called Elias Vance. He picked up on the second ring. "Elias," she said, "I need your help." A pause. Then, in that careful, measured voice she had always trusted, "What do you need?" "I need to not exist anymore," she said. Another pause. Longer this time. How soon? He said. She looked around the kitchen, the counters she had chosen, the tiles she had argued for, the window over the sink where morning light came through in a way that had always made her feel, despite everything, that she was home. 48 hours, she said. That evening, Damien came home with flowers. Not because he suspected anything. Not out of guilt. Or if it was guilt, it was the kind that sat so light on a man like Damien Rossetti that it expressed itself in grand, offhand gestures. Here are flowers. I stopped at that place you like on 5th. No reason. He was in a good mood. He talked through dinner about a deal that was closing, about a problem that had resolved itself, about nothing that touched the real architecture of his life. Camille called twice during dinner. He let it go to voicemail both times, which told Naomi everything she needed to know about how comfortable he had become. Your sister's been calling a lot lately, Naomi said, not looking up from her plate. He didn't pause. She's got something going on with that guy she's been seeing. She keeps asking me for advice. A small, dismissive sound. You know how she is. I do, Naomi said. I really do. He looked up then. Something passed across his face. Not guilt, more like the faint alertness of a man who has just heard a sound he can't quite place. Then it was gone. You should call her, he said. She misses you. Naomi picked up her fork. Maybe, she said. That night she began moving things. Not packing. She couldn't pack, not with the staff in the house, not with the security cameras that Damien had framed as protection, but that Naomi had always understood were also a way of seeing. She moved herself. She memorized. She cataloged. She identified the 12 things in this house that were truly hers. Not things Damien had given her, not things that were tangled up in the life they had built together, but the 12 objects that belonged to Naomi Carter alone. Her grandmother's ring, the journal she had kept since college, her original medical school acceptance letter in the frame her mother had bought at a dollar store in painted gold, 7 others she would not leave behind. She made a mental list. She committed it to memory the way she committed surgical procedures to memory, without notes, without writing anything down, because writing things down left evidence, and Naomi was done leaving evidence of herself anywhere near Damien Rossetti's world. 2 days. She needed 2 days. The next morning, Camille arrived at the house unannounced. This was not unusual. Camille had always treated the mansion like a second home, drifting in and out with the kind of entitled ease that Naomi had once mistaken for closeness, and now recognized as something far uglier. She came in through the side entrance that she had her own code for, a code Damien had given her for convenience, he'd said, wearing a dress that was trying very hard not to look expensive, carrying 2 coffees from the place on 5th. I brought you a decaf, she said, setting the cup on the kitchen island. She was looking at Naomi's stomach when she said it, not Naomi's face. You look tired. I am tired, Naomi said. Camille leaned against the counter. She had always had that way of positioning herself in a room, slightly too central, slightly too comfortable, as if she were practicing for a version of the room where she was the one who lived there. You should let the staff handle more. Damien worries about you doing too much. Damien tells you that? A beat, barely perceptible. He mentioned it. Naomi said. Camille picked up her own coffee, and in the careful way she looked at everything except Naomi's eyes, Naomi saw something she had missed before. Not guilt. Camille didn't do guilt. She had always been too good at justifying herself to feel it cleanly. What Naomi saw was ambition. The particular hunger of someone who has spent their entire life watching someone else have the thing they wanted and has finally decided to stop watching. She thinks she's already won, Naomi realized. The understanding came without drama, without tears, without the hot rush of rage she might have expected. It came quietly, the way important things usually came to Naomi, as information, as data, as something she could work with. How's everything with you? Naomi asked. With the guy you're seeing? Camille smiled. It was the smile of someone enjoying a private joke. Better than ever, she said. Good, said Naomi. I'm glad you're happy. And she meant it. She genuinely, entirely meant it. Because in approximately 36 hours, Camille was going to walk into this kitchen and find it exactly the way it looked right now, and Naomi Carter was not going to be anywhere on this earth that either of them could find her. She poured herself a glass of water, and stood at the window over the sink, looking at the morning light coming through, and let herself feel for exactly 1 minute all of it: the love, the grief, the fury, the devastating specific sadness of losing a sister you never actually had. 1 minute. She counted. Then she turned around and asked Camille if she wanted to stay for breakfast. That night, their last night in the same house, though only Naomi knew it, Damien reached for her in the dark with a tenderness that would have, 3 days ago, undone her entirely. He held her the way he had held her after the miscarriage, close and careful, his hand warm against the curve of her stomach. "I keep thinking about names," he said quietly. "Liana," she said. It was the name she had chosen. She had never told him before. He was quiet for a moment. "Liana," he repeated, tasting it. "That's beautiful." "I think so," she said. She let him hold her. She let herself feel the warmth of him, the familiar weight and rhythm of him, because she was not a woman who lied to herself, not anymore. And the truth was that she had loved this man with every honest piece of herself she'd had available, and none of that was false, and none of it was stupid. And the fact that it had ended here did not retroactively make it something less than what it was. She had loved him. She was going to leave him. Both things were true. In the morning, while he was in the shower, she picked up the prepaid phone and sent Elias 2 words. "Tomorrow night." His response came in under a minute. "Ready." She set the phone down and went to make breakfast for the last time in the kitchen she had designed, in the house that had her name on the deed, in the life that was about to cease to exist. She set his coffee on the counter. She folded his newspaper the way he liked. She sat down across from the empty chair where he would sit in 10 minutes and look at her and see exactly what he always saw: his wife, tired and pregnant and present and utterly, completely predictable. He had no idea. Naomi Carter had exactly 22 hours left to live. Not her body. Her body was going with her. But the woman Damien Rossetti had married, the woman who had bent herself into the shape of a mafia king's wife and told herself it was love, who had stayed quiet when she should have spoken and spoken carefully when she should have screamed, who had given 7 years and 1 kidney of trust to a man who had laughed in a room with her sister. That woman was going to die tomorrow night, and she was going to let her. She made his eggs the way he liked them. 2, over easy, the yolks barely set, with the edges crisped just enough that they held their shape when he pushed them around the plate, but broke the moment he pressed down with his fork. 7 years. She had made this man eggs approximately 900 times, and she could do it with her eyes closed, with one hand while holding a phone conversation, while half asleep. The muscle memory of loving someone was a strange and brutal thing. Damien came downstairs at 7:42. She heard him before she saw him. The particular weight of his footsteps, slightly heavier on the right foot from a break that had healed wrong 15 years ago before she knew him. The small sound his watch made against the stair railing when his hand dragged across it. She knew this man the way surgeons know anatomy, every structure, every fault line. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she said. She slid the plate onto the counter in front of him without turning around. "Coffee's ready?" He sat. She heard the scrape of the stool, the small sound of him picking up his fork. Behind her, she was already calculating: 1 suitcase, small enough to carry without help, packed with the 12 things that were hers, and 3 changes of clothes for a woman who was about to stop being herself. The prepaid phone was in the pocket of her cardigan. Elias had sent the first document package at 4 in the morning: a medical research position, a new Social Security file, a lease agreement for a studio apartment in a building associated with the Westbridge Institute for Biomedical Research, a place so carefully insulated from the outside world that even federal investigators needed 3 separate clearances to make a formal inquiry inside its network. She had read through every document standing in the bathroom with the door locked and the shower running. "You sleep okay?" she asked him. "Fine," he said. "Had a call at 3. Went back to sleep." She finally turned and looked at him. He was reading something on his phone, fork moving automatically to his mouth, chewing without looking at his food. He looked exactly the way he always looked: pressed shirt, dark eyes, the jaw that had gone slightly harder over the years in the way powerful men's faces always did, like the bone itself was accommodating all the decisions. He looked like a man with nothing to answer for. She wondered how long it had been going on. She had run the numbers in the night, the way she ran differential diagnoses, starting from the most recent evidence and working backward, looking for the moment she had missed. 6 months was her best estimate, maybe 8. The small trip Camille had taken to a friend's place in Connecticut in March. The dinner last November when Damien had come home 40 minutes later than expected and had smelled like something she hadn't been able to name then but could name now. 8 months. Approximately 240 days during which she had cooked his eggs and kissed him goodbye and pressed her palm against her own stomach and believed she was building something real. "I was thinking," Damien said, still looking at his phone, "that we should talk about the nursery before the baby comes. I want to get it finished properly." "Sure," she said. "I'll have Marcos bring in the contractor this week." "Okay," she said. He finally looked up. Something moved across his face, that same faint alertness she'd caught the night before, a flicker of something animal, some instinct that had kept him alive long enough to build an empire trying to tell him that the air in this room was different. "You sure you're all right? I told you, I didn't sleep well." He held her eyes for a moment. She gave him nothing, not coldness, not warmth, just the tired, neutral face of a pregnant woman who had been awake since 3, which was true enough to feel like honesty even if it was the least of everything. He nodded. His eyes went back to his phone. She turned back to the counter and gripped the edge of the sink and stood there for 3 seconds, breathing, just breathing, the way she used to stand outside the OR doors in the worst cases and remind herself that her hands needed to be steadier than anything she was feeling. Then she let go, dried her hands on the dish towel, and said she was going upstairs to lie down. He said, "Good, rest." She did not look back at him when she left the kitchen. At 10:15, while Damien was in his office on a call that would last, based on pattern, approximately 90 minutes, Naomi went to the hall closet, retrieved the small duffel bag she had positioned at the very back behind a coat that hadn't moved in 2 winters, and carried it upstairs to the ensuite bathroom. She worked methodically. The 12 objects first: her grandmother's ring wrapped in a square of soft cloth, the journal, the acceptance letter carefully removed from its frame and rolled inside a cardboard tube, the others. Then 3 changes of clothes, practical, nothing that would be remembered. The prepaid phone. A burner credit card Elias had arranged under the new name, loaded with enough money to live on for 90 days. She was halfway through zipping the bag when she heard a door open downstairs. Not Damien's office door. The side entrance. Camille. She heard the particular rhythm of her sister's walk. Quick, proprietary, like she was always slightly in a hurry to get to the thing she wanted. She heard her call out, "Damien?" in that voice that always landed slightly too familiar. And she heard Damien's office door open, heard the muffled exchange of 2 people who had stopped being careful. She zipped the bag the rest of the way. She set it back in the bathroom, behind the hamper, where the cleaning staff had a standing instruction not to move anything from that corner because Dr. Carter keeps medical supplies there. An instruction she had given 6 weeks ago and had not, until last night, understood why some part of her had felt the need to give it. Then she walked downstairs. Camille was standing in the kitchen, back to the doorway, doing the thing she always did, positioning herself in the center of the room as if she lived there. She was on her phone, laughing at something. Damien was at the counter, pouring a second coffee, and he heard Naomi's step and turned, and for just a fraction of a second, so small it would have been invisible to anyone not trained to read the body's involuntary signals, his shoulders came up, barely, almost nothing, but she caught it. "Hey," Camille said, turning, not bothering to get off her phone. "I was just in the neighborhood. Thought I'd see if you needed anything." Naomi looked at her sister. At the dress she was wearing, which was one Naomi recognized from a shopping trip they had taken together 3 months ago, Camille had said it was too expensive and Naomi had offered to buy it for her as a birthday gift, and Camille had laughed and said, No, I'll get it myself." She was wearing it now. She was wearing it to Naomi's house, in Naomi's kitchen, standing next to Naomi's husband. "I'm fine," Naomi said. "Thank you for thinking of me." "You look pale." "I feel fine." Camille finally said something into her phone and hung up, pocketing it in a gesture that was too smooth, too practiced. The practiced casualness of someone who has been rehearsing normal for months. "I was telling Damien you should let the staff take over more. You're 7 months pregnant. You shouldn't be managing a whole household." "I'm not managing anything," Naomi said pleasantly. "I'm just living here." The words landed quietly. Damien's hand, lifting his coffee cup, paused almost imperceptibly. Camille smiled. I just worry about you. I know you do, Naomi said. There was a silence. Not an empty silence. A full one, the kind that has things living in it. Damien broke it first, the way dominant men always did, by filling space with motion. He said something about a call he needed to get back to, set his cup down, touched Naomi's shoulder briefly as he passed, a gesture so automatic she wasn't sure he even registered doing it, and left the kitchen. Camille watched him go. And in the half-second before she rearranged her face, Naomi saw it, the way her sister's eyes followed Damien out of the room. Not casual, not the way you'd watch anyone leave, the way you watch something you considered yours. I should lie down, Naomi said. Camille turned back to her. Of course. She crossed to Naomi and took her hands, and her hands were warm and her expression was perfectly arranged, and Naomi thought, this is what she's been practicing, this exact moment. Call me if you need anything. I mean it. You'll be the first person I call, Naomi said. She watched her sister drive away from the upstairs window. She stood there until the car turned out of the gate, and then she sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and stayed like that for exactly 4 minutes, not crying, just breathing through the specific weight of realizing that grief and fury could exist in the same body at the same time without canceling each other out. She had loved her sister. That was the part no one would understand afterward. Not as a concept, not as an obligation. She had loved Camille, with the complicated, lopsided, frequently frustrated love of an older sister who had spent her entire childhood trying to pull a younger one forward. She had paid for 2 semesters of Camille's college when their mother couldn't cover it. She had driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to pick Camille up from a relationship that had turned dangerous. She had introduced Camille to Damien herself 3 years ago at a dinner party, thinking, they'll like each other, he'll look out for her, family is family. She stopped. She took her hands off her face and looked at the ceiling. I introduced them. She had never let herself finish that thought before. She finished it now. Then she picked up the prepaid phone and called Elias again. He answered the way he always did. Not with a greeting, just an open line, waiting. I need to move it up, she said. Tonight. A pause. She could hear him breathing, the background sound of whatever quiet place he was working from. That gives me 6 hours less than we planned. I know. The biometrics package for the Westbridge clearance isn't finalized until midnight. Can it be done by 10? Another pause. Longer. It can be done by 9 if I make 2 calls I was hoping to avoid making. Make them, she said. Naomi. He said her name the way he had always said it, carefully, like it was something that could be damaged. Once I make those calls, this is permanent. There's no version of this where you change your mind in a week and come back. You understand that. I understand it better than anything I've ever understood, she said. A long silence. Okay, he said. Elias. She paused. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. Just take care of that baby. She hung up. She sat for another moment, then stood and went back to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. 34 years old, 7 months pregnant. A woman who had survived a surgical residency in one of the most brutal programs in the Northeast, who had performed 11-hour procedures without sitting down, who had told families things no one should ever have to be told and kept her hands steady while doing it. A woman who had built herself from the ground up, piece by piece, and then had very quietly allowed someone else to decide what the finished version should look like. Not anymore, she said to the woman in the mirror. The woman in the mirror didn't look triumphant. She looked like someone about to step off the edge of something very high, in the full knowledge that there was no net. She looked, Naomi thought, more like herself than she had in years. At 4 in the afternoon, Damien left for what he said was a meeting at the Ferrante building downtown. Naomi stood at the window and watched the car until it disappeared, and then she counted to 60, and then she moved. She went room to room with the calm efficiency of someone on a countdown. The duffel bag from the bathroom. The small envelope she had left in the inner pocket of her winter coat. 4 photographs, physical prints. The only photograph she was taking, because photographs existed on every device in this house, and every device was accessible to people who worked for Damien Rossetti. The photographs she chose were small and specific. Her mother at 40, standing in the backyard of the house Naomi had grown up in. Naomi at 22 in her white coat, first day of residency, grinning so hard her face looked like it might crack. The ultrasound image, and one photograph of herself and Damien, not a posed one, not from a party or an occasion, a photograph someone had taken without them knowing at a restaurant 3 years ago, of the two of them leaning toward each other across a small table, laughing. She didn't know why she was taking it. She took it anyway. She was not going to lie to herself about what she was leaving behind. She called a car through a service Elias had set up under the new name. Not a car from Damien's network, not a private service anyone in this house had ever used. A vehicle that would not exist afterward in any log that Damien's people could access. She wrote one note. Not to Damien, not to Camille. To the head of the household staff, a woman named Rosa who had worked in this house for 11 years before Naomi arrived, and who had, in all that time, maintained the particular loyalty of someone who saw everything and understood that her job was to say nothing. Naomi had respected that loyalty. She had also, in the last 2 years, come to understand that Rosa's silence was not the same as approval. The note said, "Please make sure the plants in the east study are watered. The orchid by the window is sensitive to direct light. Thank you for everything. No explanation. No goodbye. Nothing that looked like a goodbye." She set it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. Then she picked up her bag and walked out the side entrance. The car was waiting at the service road behind the property. The driver was a young woman who didn't look at her face and didn't ask questions, which meant Elias had briefed her, which meant Elias was operating at a level of planning that Naomi was intensely grateful for and would think about later when she had the luxury of thinking about something that wasn't the next 5 minutes. She got in. The door closed. The car moved. She did not look back at the house. She had told herself she wouldn't, and she didn't. She looked instead at her hands in her lap. The surgeon's hands, the ones she had trained and trusted for 11 years, the ones that had saved people's lives on tables while everything else was noise. And she pressed them flat against her thighs and felt them shake, just slightly, just once, and then they were still. Elias met her at a medical campus parking structure 40 minutes away. He was older than she remembered, or maybe she just hadn't seen him in long enough that the years showed differently. He was standing next to a dark gray sedan with a duffel bag of his own and a tablet under his arm. And when she stepped out of the car, he looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who had been afraid she wouldn't come. "You look terrible," he said. "Thank you," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Medically." "I'm 30 weeks. Everything's normal." She paused. "I need to know the Westbridge clearance is solid." "It's solid." He handed her the tablet. On it was a complete identity file. Dr. Maya Brooks, 34, medical researcher, specialization in maternal fetal medicine and immunological pharmacology, unmarried, no children, educational and professional history that would hold up under standard background screening, and a biometric overlay file that had been integrated into the Westbridge Institute's intake system at 9:07 that morning. Everything that was Naomi Carter in the Federal Medical Registry, the State Licensing Board, the financial system, the marriage registry. It's been flagged as a clerical closure. The records exist, but they're buried under 3 layers of administrative lock. Someone looking specifically and with significant resources could theoretically dig them up, but it would take time. And there would be no trail leading here. She scrolled through the file. Maya Brooks. She said the name silently, testing it, the way you test a suture by pulling gently before you trust it with weight. "I need one thing," she said. "What?" "I need the original marriage certificate accessible, not deleted, not buried so deep it can't be found." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because there's a child involved," she said. "And whatever I feel about Damien Rossetti, I'm not going to make my daughter legally illegitimate because her mother needed to disappear. When the time comes, when Liana is old enough, when the world looks different, I want there to be a record she can find." Elias was quiet for a moment. "That's a risk." "I know what it is," she said. "Do it anyway." He nodded. He took the tablet back and made a note. Then he looked at her again, in that careful, measuring way she associated with him, the way she had spent years hoping to cultivate in herself. "What are you going to do if he finds you?" The question hung in the cold air of the parking structure. "He's not going to find me," she said. "He has resources that I know what he has." She picked up her duffel bag. "And right now, he doesn't know he's looking. By the time he knows he's looking, I'll be someone he's never met." Elias drove her to the Westbridge Institute himself. The facility was 2.5 hours outside the city, a self-contained research campus behind a security perimeter that had been funded, originally, by a biomedical defense contract and had retained that level of access restriction long after the government funding had ended. Researchers who worked there were, for the duration of their tenure, essentially off the grid by institutional design. Secure communication protocols, housing on campus, medical services on campus, a community of scientists who had all, in various ways, chosen the kind of work that required them to set aside the rest of their lives for a while. It was the closest thing to a perfectly engineered disappearance that didn't require faking a death. They drove without talking for the first hour. Somewhere past the city limits, the sky opened up, and it began to rain. The kind of heavy, indifferent November rain that turned highways gray and made everything feel like the middle of something rather than the beginning. Naomi watched it against the window and thought, for the second time in 24 hours, about the kitchen she had left, the window over the sink, the way the morning came through it. She thought about Liana. Her daughter was going to be born in a place her father didn't know. She was going to take her first breath in a world where her mother was someone new. She would have, at least for her first years, a version of childhood that was quiet and safe and hers, and if that came at a cost, the cost was something Naomi had decided she was willing to pay, not because it was painless, but because the alternative was worse. "How long before he notices I'm gone?" she asked, not particularly to Elias, more just to the rain. "You said his meeting was this afternoon?" "Yes." "He'll expect home for dinner. When you're not there and you're not answering your phone, he'll wait an hour before he calls around, then another hour before he tells his people to look. So, call it 9, 10 o'clock tonight before anyone is genuinely alarmed." She nodded. "By 9 o'clock tonight," Elias said carefully, "you'll be processed through Westbridge intake, and your old phone will be in 3 pieces in 3 different trash cans in 3 different counties." She almost smiled. "You plan the trash cans." "I plan everything," he said, not with pride, just as a fact. Naomi leaned her head back against the seat. The baby moved, a slow, rolling motion, different from the sharp kicks of the past few days, something almost deliberate. She put her hand over her stomach. "She's going to be okay," she said, not to Elias, to herself, to Liana, to whatever version of the future existed beyond the rain and the highway and the thing she was driving toward. She's going to be more than okay. At 8:53 in the evening, a woman named Dr. Maya Brooks checked into the residential intake facility at the Westbridge Institute for Biomedical Research. She had a duffel bag, a medical file, a research appointment that had been scheduled 6 weeks prior, and a security clearance that placed her, for the foreseeable future, behind walls that not even a federal inquiry could penetrate without significant lead time. At 9:44 that same evening, in a house 40 miles away, Damien Rossetti walked through the front door and called his wife's name. The kitchen was clean. The coffee maker was ready for the morning. On the counter beside it was a note about watering the plants. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. He called her name again, quieter this time, and when the house gave back nothing but its own silence, something moved across his face that was not the alertness she had seen that morning, not the comfortable ease of a man who thought he was managing everything fine. It was fear. The particular bone-level fear of a man who has just realized that the most important thing in his life has been making plans he knew nothing about, and that those plans are already finished. He called her phone. It rang 4 times in a trash can behind a rest stop off Interstate 84, where no one would find it until morning, and by then it would already be in pieces. And by then Naomi Carter would already be 3 hours gone into a life that had no room in it for Damien Rossetti's fear. He called again, and again. By midnight, he had 12 men looking for her, and every one of them came back empty. By 2 in the morning, he was standing in the room they had built for the baby, unfinished, the crib still in its box, the walls still unpainted. And for the first time in 15 years, Damien Rossetti, who had built an empire on the premise that the world bent to the force of his will, had absolutely no idea what to do. The note on the counter said nothing about where she had gone. The orchid by the window in the east study was past saving. He hadn't watered it in weeks. The first 6 weeks at Westbridge were the quietest of Naomi's adult life. Not peaceful. Quiet is not the same as peaceful. She understood that distinction better than most. having spent years in operating rooms where the silence was the most deceptive part, where the stillness of a body on a table told you nothing about the war happening inside it. The quiet at Westbridge was the quiet of removal, of having stripped away every layer of the life she had been living until what remained was just her. Her mind, her work, her body carrying a child who kicked harder every week, as if to remind her that stillness was temporary. She woke at 5:30 every morning in a studio apartment on the third floor of the residential wing. The room was small and functional and had exactly nothing in it that she hadn't put there herself. A second-hand lamp she'd bought from the campus exchange, a print she'd ordered online, 2 overlapping circles in dark blue, a Venn diagram that she'd hung at the foot of the bed because it made her think about the way problems had solutions if you just found the point of intersection. The 12 objects from her old life were distributed around the space with a deliberateness she didn't examine too closely. Her grandmother's ring on the windowsill in the morning, moved to the drawer at night, moved back again without her fully deciding to. She worked. She worked the way she had always worked when everything else was falling apart, as if the work were a country she could live inside, with its own geography and its own weather and its own rules that had nothing to do with anything outside its borders. Dr. Maya Brooks was a maternal-fetal medicine researcher with a secondary focus on immunological markers in high-risk pregnancies, and the specialty was not accidental. Naomi had designed it herself because it was close enough to what she already knew that she could do it credibly, and because studying the biology of at-risk pregnancies while carrying one felt like the closest she could get to the conversation she was having with her own body every single day. The other researchers left her alone, which was what she needed, and also, on certain evenings, the thing that felt most like grief. She had been at Westbridge exactly 43 days when the first sign came. It was nothing dramatic. A man she didn't recognize sitting in a car in the visitor lot for 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. She noticed him because she had trained herself to notice anyone who wasn't moving with purpose, and because the car was a rental, she could tell by the plate, a detail she had absorbed from Damien without ever intending to. And because the visitor lot at Westbridge was accessed through a security checkpoint that required a pre-approved purpose and a registered contact inside the facility, which meant whoever this man was, he had a name to give at the gate. She wrote down the plate number. She told Elias that evening. He was quiet for a longer time than she liked. "I'll look into it," he said. "How concerned should I be?" "On a scale of 1 to 10. A pause. 4, maybe 5. It might be nothing." "It's not nothing," she said. "Damien's people move in rentals. It's policy. Keeps the fleet unregistered to any one entity." "I know," Elias said. "I said I'll look into it." She didn't sleep well that night. She lay on her left side, the only position that was comfortable at this stage of the pregnancy, and she put her hand on her stomach and she thought about the gap between 4 or 5 and nothing. And she decided that Elias, who was brilliant and careful and one of the best people she knew, was also a man who had spent most of his career in controlled environments and occasionally underestimated what it meant to be on the wrong side of someone like Damien Rossetti's attention. The car wasn't there the next morning. It was back on Thursday. Different plate, same model, same spot. Same 3 hours, 9 to noon, and then gone. She called Elias again. This time he picked up faster. "It's not his direct people," Elias said. And she could hear in his voice that this was supposed to be reassuring and that he already knew it wasn't going to land that way. The plate traces to a private investigation firm out of Delaware, mid-tier operation, usually hired for insurance work and corporate surveillance, not mafia infrastructure. "He's outsourcing the search," she said. "It's actually a good sign in terms of proximity. If he had a direct lead on your location, he wouldn't be using a PI firm. He'd be using—" "He's triangulating," she said. "He's throwing a wide net, PIs in multiple locations. He doesn't know where I am, but he knows the shape of where I might be." She sat down on the edge of her bed. "How wide is the net?" A pause. "I don't know yet." "Find out," she paused. "And Elias, the biometric file, the Westbridge intake record. You said it was integrated directly into their system. Who had access to that integration on their end?" A longer pause. One that told her the answer before he said it. "Standard protocol would have been the head of research intake and the institute director," he said slowly, "and the IT administrator who ran the clearance sync. 3 people. 3 people inside Westbridge knew a new identity file was being integrated outside normal channels," he said. "I trusted them. I've worked with 2 of them for—" "Trust isn't the question," she said. Money is. Damien doesn't need people to want to betray me. He just needs to make the number big enough that they decide it's not personal. She stood up. Find out which one of the three is driving a new car. The silence that followed was the silence of a careful man realizing that he had made an error and understanding exactly how large it was. Give me 24 hours, he said. You have 12, she said. She hung up and stood in the center of her small room and did the thing she had learned to do in the worst moments of her surgical training. She stopped feeling and started thinking. Feeling was noise. Thinking was signal. She needed signal. If the breach was at Westbridge, then Maya Brooks was already compromised as an identity. Not fully. Damien's PI firm was still circling at a distance, which meant the breach was probably recent, probably incomplete. Someone had likely sold the confirmation that a woman matching Naomi's general profile had been integrated into Westbridge under a non-standard clearance. Not a name, not a room number, just a thread. But Damien Rossetti had built an empire by knowing which threads to pull. She had 11 weeks left in the pregnancy. She had planned to deliver at the Westbridge Medical Facility under Maya Brooks's name, with Elias as her listed emergency contact and a neonatology team that didn't know the backstory. Now she was looking at the possibility that in 11 weeks or less, someone was going to walk through the door of this facility with Damien's resources behind them and the specific instruction to find a black female medical researcher, late-stage pregnant, who had arrived approximately 6 weeks ago. She had 12 things from her old life in this room. She started thinking about which of them she could carry. Elias called back in 9 hours. The IT administrator, he said. His name is Kevin Marsh, 31. He has a daughter with a degenerative condition. Rare, expensive, the kind of treatment that insurance doesn't fully cover and that medical debt doesn't forgive. 3 weeks ago, a consulting firm made an inquiry through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, asking about recent non-standard intake processes at Westbridge. He answered it. How much? The initial payment was $80,000. She sat with that for a moment. $80,000. And a daughter who was sick. And a man who had spent years watching researchers walk through the doors of this place while he managed the back-end infrastructure, invisible and underpaid. She couldn't hate Kevin Marsh. She didn't have room for it, and it wouldn't help her. And the truth was she understood exactly the arithmetic he had done. He doesn't know who I am, she said. He only knows about the intake irregularity. Correct. He confirmed a non-standard clearance for a woman in the maternal-fetal medicine division. He did not have access to the identity file itself or the Maya Brooks name. But whoever hired him does now know to look in the maternal-fetal medicine division of a secure research campus for a pregnant woman. Yes. So the net is smaller. Significantly smaller, Elias said, but still not a precise location. She was quiet for a moment. Then, how long until it is? If they're methodical? He exhaled. 4 weeks, 6 at the outside. She was 32 weeks pregnant. She had, at minimum, 6 weeks until the baby came. More likely 8. The math did not work. I need a second layer, she said. A transfer. Somewhere the Westbridge intake data doesn't follow. There's a facility in Montreal, Elias said carefully. The Brennan Center for Advanced Research. The intake protocols are different. Research appointments. They're processed through a European data partnership that isn't accessible through U.S. investigative channels without a formal international request, which takes minimum 8 weeks to process. If I can get you a position there, can you do it in 72 hours? He inhaled. Naomi. Can you do it? I need 72 hours and a favor I've been saving for something catastrophic. This qualifies, she said. I know, he said. I know it does. She packed the 12 things. She moved through the motions of the next 2 days as Dr. Maya Brooks. She attended her morning research briefing. She submitted her weekly report. She had lunch in the common room with a molecular biologist named Sandra, who had been the closest thing she'd had to a friend in this place, and who had asked precisely 3 personal questions in 6 weeks, all of which Naomi had answered in ways that were technically accurate and entirely uninformative. She was going to miss Sandra in the specific way you missed people you had glimpsed the possibility of knowing. On the second day, something happened that she had not planned for. She was in the research library at 3 in the afternoon, working through a database of immunological studies, when she felt the first contraction. Not a real one. She knew the difference. She had read every piece of clinical literature on preterm labor that existed. She had spent the last 4 weeks monitoring her own body with the obsessive precision of someone who was both the doctor and the patient. This was a Braxton Hicks contraction, her uterus rehearsing, which was normal at 32 weeks, and not a cause for alarm in a standard pregnancy. She was not in a standard pregnancy. She was in a pregnancy defined by sustained high-level stress, inadequate sleep, and the physiological load of carrying a child while dismantling and reconstructing her own existence. She knew the statistics on stress and preterm birth. She had written about those statistics. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach under the table and breathed through it and waited for it to pass. It passed in 40 seconds. She sat very still for a moment afterward, and she thought about Damien's hand on her stomach in the dark, the night before she left, and she hated herself a little for the fact that the memory brought with it something that felt, against all logic and will, like comfort. She hated herself for it, and then she let it go, because self-hatred was also noise, and she did not have room for noise. The Montreal transfer came through at 11:50 on the third day. Elias sent the confirmation to the prepaid tablet, a 12-month research appointment at the Brennan Center, processed under the Maya Brooks identity, cross-referenced through the European Data Protocol, departure by privately arranged medical transport that would keep her completely off commercial travel records. She was scheduled to leave at 6 the following morning. At 3 in the morning, the campus security alert system sent a notification to every residential unit. An unscheduled visitor had attempted entry at the West Perimeter Gate and had been turned away. The visitor had presented credentials for a legal services firm and had requested access to the Maternal Fetal Medicine Residential Research Wing, specifically. Not to Dr. Maya Brooks, not to a specific name, to a specific wing. Naomi was already awake when the notification came through. She was sitting on the edge of her bed with the duffel bag packed and the 12 objects accounted for, and the tablet in her hand, and she read the notification twice, and then she texted Elias one word, now. His response came in under 2 minutes. Car is already outside the east gate. Go. She went. The hallway of the residential wing was empty. It was 3 in the morning, and researchers kept strange hours, but not usually this strange. She moved quickly and quietly, the duffel bag over one shoulder, one hand pressed lightly against the wall on her right for balance. Because 32 weeks pregnant and moving at speed in the dark was a combination that required some acknowledgement of physics. She took the service stairs rather than the elevator. She came out through the loading bay that she had identified in her first week here as the exit least covered by the security camera grid. A gap in coverage that was probably an oversight, probably had been an oversight for years, the kind of thing that only mattered to people who were thinking about leaving in a hurry. The car was there. Different driver this time. A man in his 50s who didn't speak, which was what she needed. She got in. The door closed. As the car moved away from the West Bridge perimeter, she looked out the back window at the facility. The lights still on in several research wings. The security booth at the West Gate where she could make out 2 figures having what looked like an animated conversation, probably about the visitor who had just been turned away. She watched until the building was out of sight, and then she turned around and sat forward and put her hands on her knees and kept them still. She had been at Westbridge 49 days. She was leaving at 3 in the morning, 6 hours ahead of schedule, because someone had sold a piece of her location for $80,000 and a sick child's medical bills, and because the man she had married, the man who was currently, she imagined, calling in every resource he had left, was not the kind of man who stopped. She had always known that. It was one of the things she had loved about him, the absolute refusal to accept a wall, the almost irrational conviction that if he pushed long enough and hard enough and with enough of himself, the thing he wanted would eventually yield. She had loved it. She was now running from it at 3 in the morning. The drive to the private airfield took an hour and 20 minutes. By the time they arrived, the first thin line of something gray was beginning at the edge of the sky. Not dawn yet, just the sky's announcement that dawn was coming, which felt like either the worst metaphor or the most honest one. Elias was on the phone with her for the last 20 minutes of the drive. Practical logistics. The Brennan Center contact. The medical protocol that had been set up for her delivery, now transferred to a hospital in Montreal with the same European data protections. He talked through it methodically, and she listened and asked the right questions and confirmed the right details, and when they reached the airfield, he said, "Naomi." She stopped him. Don't. I was going to say that you're one of the bravest people I've ever known. She was quiet for a second. You were going to say you're sorry. He didn't deny it. Both things can be true. I don't need sorry right now, she said. I need Montreal. You have Montreal, he said. She got on the plane. It was a small aircraft, 6 seats, no attendant, a pilot who had the professionally incurious manner of someone Elias had used before. She settled into the window seat and buckled in and waited for the sound of the engine. And while she waited, she felt the baby move, that rolling, deliberate movement she had come to think of as Liana's way of checking in, of saying, I'm here, I'm still here, we're still doing this together. And she put her hand over it and felt the pressure of her daughter's foot or elbow or knee, whatever part of her was pressing against the wall of the world she was living in, and she held it there. She was going to be okay. She repeated it because she needed to, not because she was certain, and there was a difference. And she was done pretending there wasn't. The plane lifted. Below her, the landscape flattened out into the gray-green of early morning, the highway cutting through it like a scar. The lights of the city already shrinking, already becoming something she was already past. She thought about the last conversation she'd had with Damien that she hadn't known was a last conversation. The eggs over easy. The newspaper folded the way he liked. The hand on her shoulder as he passed, so automatic he probably hadn't registered it. I love you, he had said at the door. I know, she had said. She had meant, I know. And it isn't enough. And I am so tired of pretending that love is the same thing as safety. The plane leveled off. She put her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, and she slept for the first time in 3 days. Not comfortably, not deeply, but the way the body sleeps when it has finally accepted that it has no choice. The sudden, involuntary surrender of a system that has been running on emergency power for too long. Below her, the country moved away. Somewhere in it, Damien Rossetti had just received a report from the Westgate security incident at Westbridge. Somewhere in it, a man named Kevin Marsh was opening his banking application and staring at a balance that represented the price of his conscience. Somewhere in it, Camille was waking up in a bed that was becoming, in her own imagination, the bed she deserved to be waking up in. And somewhere in it, the woman who had been Naomi Carter was 30,000 feet above all of it, carrying a daughter who did not yet have a birthday and a life that did not yet have a shape, crossing a border that was not the one on the map, but the one inside her own chest, the one between the woman she had been and the woman she was going to have to become in order to give her child something better than the ruins of everything that came before. The clouds came up around the plane. The city disappeared. Naomi slept. Damien stood in the operations room of what remained of his empire. The inner circle, the 6 men who had been with him long enough to have scars they'd earned in his service. And he put both hands flat on the table and looked at the Westbridge incident report and the gap in the security footage from the East Loading Bay and the timestamp on the private airfield's after-hours flight log, which one of his men had accessed through a connection that had cost considerably more than Kevin Marsh's $80,000. She was there, he said. It wasn't a question. She was there, Marco confirmed. Gone by 3:15. Where? Not a question either, just the word, stripped of everything except its demand. We don't know yet. Damien looked at the flight log for a long moment. Small aircraft. No flight plan filed through the standard registry, which meant either an instrument flight rules exemption or a connection to an aviation entity that operated outside the conventional tracking systems. Someone had planned this. Someone had planned every layer of this, with a precision and a patience that Damien recognized because it was the same precision he had applied to every acquisition, every strategy, every move in the years it had taken him to build the thing he had built. She had learned it from watching him. The realization moved through him without drama, without the blunt force of surprise, because it was too cleanly true for surprise. She had spent 7 years watching how he operated. She had watched and absorbed and cataloged, the way she cataloged everything, the way she had always been, from the very beginning, the person in the room who was paying the most attention while also appearing to simply be present. He had thought he was the most dangerous person in his marriage. He had been wrong. Find the airfield's maintenance crew, he said quietly, privately. Don't scare anyone. I want information, not attention. He straightened up. And get me everything there is on a Dr. Elias Vance. Former academic, medical field, He was her mentor at Harlow Medical. He paused. He's the one helping her. Marco was writing. What level of response? Damien looked at the gap in the loading bay footage. 47 seconds of empty hallway, and then gone, as if she had simply ceased to exist. No response, he said. Not yet. He picked up the incident report and folded it once, precisely, the way he folded everything. I'm not going to chase her with people who'll scare her. I'm going to find her first. He set the folded report down. And when I find her, I'm going to go alone. Marco looked up from his notes. The 6 men in the room all absorbed this the same way, with the careful neutrality of people who had learned that Damien Rossetti's quiet voice was a more serious instrument than his loud one. Alone, Marco repeated. Alone, Damien said. He walked out of the operations room and down the corridor to the room that had been the nursery, the one with the crib still in its box and the walls that were still unpainted, and he stood in the doorway and looked at it, and the expression on his face was something none of his men had ever seen there before, and would not have had a word for if they had. He had 6 months of empire left, at the rate things were fracturing without the stability that Naomi's presence had provided. The legitimacy, the social architecture, the way that being a man with a wife and a coming child had insulated him from certain kinds of scrutiny. The inner circle was already showing cracks. There were men who had been loyal to him for a decade who were looking at the empty seat at the table and making calculations about what the vacancy meant. He knew what it meant. He had known from the night he stood in this room at 2 in the morning with no idea what to do that the thing he had lost was not just a woman. He had lost the only thing that had ever made him something other than what he was. He put his hand on the door frame, the same gesture, the same doorway, the same man standing in it. And he stayed there for a long time, and then he went back to work, because work was the only thing that had ever made sense to him, and because somewhere above a border he couldn't cross with force and couldn't buy his way past with money. The woman he had ruined was sleeping on a plane, and his daughter, a word he was only beginning to understand the weight of, was 32 weeks into a life he had already damaged. He had time. He told himself that. He was not entirely sure he believed it, but he told himself anyway, because a man who stopped believing he had time was a man who had already lost. And Damien Rossetti had not yet figured out how to be that man. Outside, the sky was beginning to go gray. The orchid in the East Study had been dead for 3 weeks. No one had mentioned it. Montreal in February was the kind of cold that didn't ask permission. It came through walls. It came through coats. It came through the specific exhaustion of a woman 36 weeks pregnant who had been living under a borrowed name in a city that wasn't hers, sleeping in a bed that was functional and nothing more, eating meals she prepared mechanically because the baby needed fuel even when Naomi had no appetite for anything except the particular silence of 4 in the morning when the rest of the Brennan Center's residential wing was asleep, and she could sit at the window and watch the snow come down and not have to perform being fine for anyone. She had been Maya Brooks for 4 months. She was getting better at it. That was the thing that disturbed her most. Not the difficulty of maintaining the identity, but the ease. The way she had settled into the rhythms of the Brennan Center without resistance. The way her colleagues here had accepted Dr. Maya Brooks as a complete person, a woman with history and opinions, and a particular way of holding her coffee cup, without ever sensing the seams. She had become Maya Brooks the way surgeons became surgeons, through repetition, through pressure, through the slow accumulation of performed competence until performance and reality were the same thing. What disturbed her was the occasional morning when she woke up, and for 3 or 4 seconds before full consciousness arrived, she didn't remember which one she was. The baby kept her honest. The baby was Naomi's, completely and without ambiguity. The kicks, the rolls, the 4 in the morning restlessness that matched her own. The particular pressure that had moved lower in the last 2 weeks in the way the clinical literature described as the body's preparation. Its slow rearrangement toward the specific violence of birth. Liana, she thought every morning, hand on her stomach. Liana, you know who you are. That makes one of us. The Brennan Center's medical staff had been told she was a low-risk singleton pregnancy with no complications and a preference for minimal intervention. This was approximately 60% true. What they hadn't been told was that her blood pressure had been running high for 3 weeks, that she was monitoring it herself with a cuff she'd ordered through the center's supply catalog, or that 2 of the readings in the past 10 days had crossed into territory that, in any other context, would have prompted her to put a patient on bed rest and start a conversation about induction timing. She had not put herself on bed rest. She had recalibrated the thresholds in her own head with the particular dangerous flexibility of a doctor who was also the patient and who had, as a result, an excess of clinical rationalization available. She was managing it. She told herself this every morning while she wrote the number in a small notebook she kept in the drawer of the bedside table. The date, the systolic, the diastolic, the baby's movement count. A log. Evidence. The kind of record a careful person kept so that if something went wrong, there would be data, which was the thing doctors did when they were frightened and couldn't admit it. On the morning of February 9th, 6 weeks after her arrival in Montreal, she woke up with a headache behind her right eye that felt like someone had pressed a thumb into the socket and was pushing inward with steady, deliberate force. She lay still for a moment, cataloging headache, visual field check. She moved her eyes slowly to each corner and saw nothing alarming, no flickering, no visual disturbance. Her hands and face felt slightly puffy in the way they had for the past week, which she had been attributing to fluid retention and had been, she now acknowledged in the cold, specific light of this headache, perhaps underweighting. She reached for the blood pressure cuff. 154/98. She put the cuff down and looked at the ceiling and said very quietly, to no one, "Okay." Okay was not what she was feeling. What she was feeling was the controlled, focused fear of a clinician who has just seen a number that means the situation has changed. Gestational hypertension sliding toward preeclampsia at 36 weeks in a woman already carrying the physiological load of sustained high-level stress. She knew what this meant. She had managed this in other women, had made the calls, had walked residents through the decision tree, monitoring interval, magnesium consideration, delivery timing discussion. She got dressed. She went to the center's medical clinic, which opened at 7. She told the duty nurse she'd been having headaches and wanted to check her blood pressure. The nurse, a brisk Quebecois woman named Denise, who had been kind to her in the undemonstrative way of someone who was kind to everyone without making a production of it, took the reading with a clinic cuff. 157/102. Denise looked at the reading, then at Naomi. The particular look of a nurse who has seen enough to not need the number explained to her. "I'm going to get Dr. Fontaine," Denise said. "I know," Naomi said. Dr. Fontaine was the Brennan Center's staff obstetrician, a compact, precise Haitian-Canadian woman in her late 40s who had the manner of someone who had delivered several hundred babies and had decided at some point in that history that the most useful thing she could be in a crisis was completely calm. She came in, reviewed the readings, did the assessment, reflexes, urine protein dipstick, fundal height, fetal heart rate, and then she sat down across from Naomi and looked at her with the specific expression of a doctor who has something to say and has decided not to waste time not saying it. "How long have the readings been elevated?" she said. Not a question, a prompt. 3 weeks, Naomi said. Fontaine nodded once, the single nod of someone absorbing an answer they expected. "And you didn't come in?" "I was monitoring it myself." "I see that." A pause. "You're a physician?" "Yes." "Then you know exactly what I'm about to say." "I know what you're about to say," Naomi agreed. 36 weeks with preeclamptic range pressures and a 3-week history of self-managed hypertension, Fontaine said. "We're not having a conversation about whether you deliver. We're having a conversation about when." Naomi felt the baby move. Slow, rolling, the check-in motion. She put her hand on her stomach without thinking about it. "How soon?" "I want to transfer you to St. Luc today. They have the maternal fetal unit. If your pressures respond to management and the baby's monitoring looks good, we could have 2-3 days before we need to make the induction decision. If they don't respond..." Fontaine didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Today," Naomi repeated. "Within the hour, ideally." She called Elias from the clinic room while Denise arranged the transfer paperwork. He picked up immediately. He always picked up immediately now, as if he'd been waiting for a call with exactly this weight. "There's a medical situation," she said. "I'm being transferred to St. Luc. Preeclampsia." A silence that lasted exactly as long as it took him to process that sentence. Is the baby? We're both okay right now. I need you to make sure the Maya Brooks file is fully integrated into St. Luc's system before I get there. Records, history, everything. I can do that in 20 minutes. Do it in 10. She paused. Elias, has there been any movement on the search? Nothing new in the past 2 weeks, he said. The Westbridge Trail went cold. If he's still looking, he's doing it quietly. He's always doing it quietly, she said. That's not the same as not doing it. I know, I'll watch the St. Luc intake channels. Good. She pressed her free hand flat against her sternum, where the headache was beginning to migrate. I'll call you when I know more. The transfer to St. Luc took 40 minutes by medical transport. Naomi lay on the gurney with her eyes on the ceiling of the vehicle and ran through every piece of clinical information she had about what was happening in her own body with the dispassionate focus of a woman who had learned, very young, that panic was a form of abandonment of the person who needed you most, which right now was herself. The hospital intake at St. Luc was efficient and quiet. The Maya Brooks file was in the system. No one looked at her with anything except the focused attention of medical staff doing their jobs, which was all she had asked for. They put her in a monitoring room, 2 leads on her abdomen, IV line in her left arm, magnesium sulfate running slow and steady through the drip. Magnesium for seizure prevention. The specific precaution you took when the blood pressure was high enough that the brain's vasculature became the thing you were most worried about. She lay there and listened to Liana's heartbeat on the monitor. 142 beats per minute, steady and strong, a sound so essentially vital that it operated on Naomi below the level of thought, in the place where everything that mattered lived, and she thought, she doesn't know yet that any of this is hard. She just knows the heartbeat and the warmth and the fact that she is held. She had been awake for 6 hours when the first knock came at the door. It was a soft knock, too soft for medical staff, who generally knocked and entered in the same motion because their time was the currency they never had enough of. This knock waited. She looked at the door. Come in, she said. The door opened. Damien Rossetti stepped into the room. He looked terrible. That was the first thing she saw. Not the fact of him, not the 4 months of distance and reinvention and survival that had separated them, but the specific terrible of a man who had not been sleeping, who had lost weight in the angular, structural way that meant he had lost it from somewhere essential, whose face had shed whatever remained of its smoothness and had arrived at something rawer and more honest. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, dark wool, no insignia, nothing that said anything about who he was. His hands were at his sides. He stopped just inside the door. They looked at each other. 7 years, 1 betrayal, 4 months of running, 1 name change, 1 international border. And here he was in the doorway of a hospital room in Montreal, and here she was in the bed, and between them was everything that had ever been said and everything that hadn't, and the sound of their daughter's heartbeat on the monitor filling the silence like a third person in the room. How did you find me? She said. Her voice was flat. Not a question, or not only a question, also a statement about what this meant, that he had found her, that Elias's layers had not been enough, that she was in a hospital bed and could not run. He came 2 steps further into the room and stopped. He looked at her stomach, at the visible reality of the pregnancy, the monitoring leads, the IV line, and something moved across his face that was not triumph, not relief, not the composed authority she associated with him. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has just seen, for the first time and with full clarity, the damage they caused. The St. Luc intake, he said. There's a physician on the maternal fetal unit. I've been funding his research for 3 years through a foundation. He called me. A pause. He didn't know who you were. He called because a woman matching a general description I'd circulated was admitted under a non-standard transfer from a private research facility. Matching a general description, she repeated. Black woman, late 30s, late-stage pregnancy, medical background. He looked at her hands. And you still wear your grandmother's ring. She looked down at her hand. The ring was on her right hand now, not her left. She had moved it when she left, a detail she had thought was enough. And it had not been enough because Damien Rossetti had spent 7 years learning her in the same way she had learned him, and she had not fully accounted for that. She had not fully accounted for the fact that the intelligence she had used to build her escape had been partly built inside their marriage. She pulled the ring off. She set it on the bedside table. You shouldn't be here, she said. I know. Damien. She looked at him directly. The surgeon's look, the one that was not unkind but was completely unambiguous. I am in a hospital bed. I am managing a serious complication. I am doing that alone, which is what I chose. You being here does not help me." He didn't move. "I'm not here to take you anywhere." "Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man composing a manipulation. She had known that silence, had lived inside it, could recognize it the way she recognized arrhythmias by sound. This was different. This was the silence of a man who has rehearsed this conversation 100 times and has arrived at the actual moment and found that none of the rehearsed versions are right. "Because she's mine too," he said, "and I had a right to know she was in danger." The monitor beeped. 142, 143, 142. "You don't have rights here," Naomi said. "You forfeited them." "I know I did." "Then go." He didn't go. She looked at him standing there, this man she had built a life with, who had laughed in a room with her sister, who had come through 4 months in an international border and whatever it had cost him to get here, and was now standing in her hospital room with his hands at his sides and an expression she didn't have a word for. And she felt something she had not been prepared to feel. Not forgiveness, not warmth. Something more complicated and less convenient than either. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has been surviving alone for 4 months and is now, in this moment, simply too tired to maintain the full force of her anger at the same time as she was managing everything else. She was not going to tell him that. "You have 5 minutes," she said. "Then I'm calling the nurse." He crossed to the chair beside the bed, not rushing, not taking license, and sat down. He sat the way a man sat when he was trying to take up as little space as possible, which was not a thing Damien Rossetti had ever tried to do in any room she had known him in. "I ended it," he said, "with Camille. The night you disappeared. I went to her. I was going to tell her it was over anyway. I had been—" He stopped. Something moved in his jaw. "That doesn't matter. What I said to her doesn't matter." "No," Naomi agreed. "It doesn't. I haven't spoken to her since." "Good for you." She said it without heat. "I haven't spoken to her either. I don't intend to." He looked at his hands. "She tried to contact me last month. She wanted to. She thought that with you gone—" "Damien," Naomi's voice cut clean. "I don't want to talk about my sister. I don't want to talk about your affair. I don't want to talk about any of it tonight." She held his gaze. "I have preeclampsia. I am 36 weeks pregnant. My blood pressure is high enough that there are people in this hospital whose job right now is to make sure I don't have a seizure. That is the only thing that exists in this room right now." He looked at her. Really looked at her, the long specific look of someone who is seeing clearly and not flinching from what they see. And he said quietly, "Then let me help." "You can't help." "I can stay." "I don't want you to stay." "I know." He didn't move. "I'm going to anyway. I'll stay in the hall. I'll stay in the lobby. You won't see me." He paused. "But I'm not leaving this building while she's in danger." She stared at him. Something in his face had changed, something that had been there the whole time she had known him, the bedrock certainty of a man who controlled things, who managed outcomes, who did not sit in hallways and wait, had fractured, and what was underneath it was raw and less composed and she thought more real than anything she had seen from him in a long time. "Whatever I have to do," he said, "whatever you need me to be or not be in this situation, I'll do it." "You'll disappear if I tell you to," she said. "Yes." "You'll leave this hospital and not come back if I tell you to." A pause, shorter than she expected. "Yes," he said, "if that's what you need." She looked at him for a long moment. She was too tired for this. She was too medicated for this. The magnesium was making her head feel slightly thick, a well-known side effect, the price of seizure prevention. She was 36 weeks pregnant with his daughter, and her blood pressure was 157/102. And she was in a city that wasn't hers, under a name that wasn't hers, and she was, beneath all of it, beneath the competence and the planning and the survival instincts she had been running on for 4 months, deeply and completely exhausted. "Sit down," she said finally. "Don't talk." He sat. He didn't talk. The monitor beeped. The drip ran. Outside the window, Montreal was dark and cold and going about its business. Indifferent to all of this the way cities were, the way life outside hospital rooms was. Moving, constant, unaware of the particular gravity of the small rooms where people sat and waited for things to be decided. At 2 in the morning, Naomi's pressure spiked. She felt it before the monitor alarm sounded. A sudden intensity behind her right eye, a narrowing of the visual field at the periphery, not quite alarming but pointing toward alarming the way a sky points toward a storm. She pressed the call button, and in the 40 seconds before the nurse arrived, she felt the world do something strange and slow, and she said very clearly, "Get Dr. Fontaine," even though Fontaine was in Montreal, and this was not Fontaine's hospital, and she was disoriented from the magnesium and the pain. The nurse came in fast, then a second nurse, then the on-call resident, a young man who looked at the monitor reading 172/109, and turned to start giving instructions in rapid French. Damien was on his feet. "She's a physician," he said, to the room, sharply enough that it cut through the activity. "She understands everything you're saying. Talk to her directly." The resident looked at him, then at Naomi, and readjusted. "Dr. Brooks, your pressure has escalated significantly. We need to make a delivery decision now. At this level of hypertension, the risk to you and the baby—" "I know what the risk is," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very focused on keeping it steady. "What's her heart rate?" 139 stable. "My platelet trend." He read the number. She processed it. "Induction or section," she said. "Given the rate of escalation, our attending recommends—" "Section," she said. "She's 36 weeks and my pressure is moving too fast for induction timing. Do the section." The resident looked at her for a moment with the expression of a young doctor encountering a patient who is simultaneously correct and the most complicated person he has dealt with all month. "We'll need consent. Get me the form," she said. She signed it. Her hand was shaking slightly. The magnesium, the blood pressure, some combination of both. And she noticed the shaking and gripped the pen more firmly and signed her name, Maya Brooks, in the precise, slightly small handwriting she had developed over 4 months of writing a name that wasn't hers. Damien was beside the bed. He had moved there without her noticing, or she had been too focused on the consent form to track it. He was not touching her. He was simply there, in the way that physical presence could be a fact rather than an imposition. She looked up at him. "I didn't say you could stay in this room," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at the monitor. The baby's heart rate was holding. 139, strong. "Fine," she said. It wasn't permission so much as the recognition that she had exactly enough energy for what was coming and none to spare for the argument. They took her to the OR at 2:27 in the morning. She had been in ORs hundreds of times. She had never been the one on the table. The ceiling was different from this angle. She had known that intellectually, had heard patients describe it, had even mentioned it once in a lecture to residents as a useful empathy exercise. But knowing it and experiencing the specific strange vulnerability of lying flat under those lights with your arms out and the antiseptic cold of a prep drape and the sounds of a team assembling around you for something that was happening to you. That was different. That was a different thing entirely. The spinal anesthesia went in. The numbing moved through her lower body in a wave that was neither comfortable nor painful, just the abrupt absence of sensation from the waist down, which felt like a kind of amputation even though it wasn't. She breathed. She focused on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the most basic thing a body could do, the one thing that was entirely hers in this moment. Through the drape, she heard the team. Calm, competent, bilingual French-English. Call and response of a practiced surgical team. She heard the scrub nurses count. She heard the attending surgeon's low, unhurried voice. She felt nothing from the waist down. She felt everything above it. At 2:51, Liana Rossetti, born in Montreal in February, unnamed on the official record as anything but Brooks, her father's name not yet attached to anything, her history not yet written, entered the world. She did not cry immediately. That 2-second silence was the loudest thing Naomi had ever heard. And then the cry came, thin, startled, furious, the outrage of a person who has been removed from the only home they have ever known and is fully prepared to make that objection known. And Naomi exhaled with a force that felt like something she had been holding for 36 weeks, for 4 months, for 7 years, all releasing at once. And she turned her head toward the sound of her daughter's voice and she said, "Is she okay?" "She's beautiful," the scrub nurse said, and her voice had the specific warmth of someone who delivered that information often and had not yet stopped meaning it. They brought the baby to her face. Tiny, Liana was small, 5 pounds 2 ounces, the compressed fragility of a child who had arrived slightly early into a world that had been more turbulent than any child deserved. She had a full head of dark hair and eyes that were squeezed shut against the light, and a mouth that was still working through its first objections. And she was the most complete thing Naomi had ever seen. "Hey," Naomi said softly. "Hey, I've got you." Liana turned her head toward her mother's voice with the blind, absolute instinct of the very new. She found it. Her mouth stopped its protest. She settled. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, she felt the specific quality of a thing that has been held under enormous pressure for a very long time, finally being allowed to breathe. They took the baby for assessment. The team continued their work on the other side of the drape. Naomi lay still and let them. She was aware, at the edge of her attention, that Damien was somewhere in this hospital. She was aware that in a few hours she would have to make decisions about what that meant, what she would allow, what she would refuse, how she was going to hold the boundary between the man he had been and the situation they were both now inside. She was aware that the boundary had already shifted simply by the fact of him being here, and that she didn't have the energy yet to know what to do about that. She was aware of all of it. But right now, in this moment, at 2:51 in the morning in a hospital room in Montreal, all of it could wait. A nurse came back with a small wrapped bundle and placed it against Naomi's cheek. Just her cheek, her arms were still constrained for the procedure, and Liana made a small sound against her mother's face, a sound so specific and so new that it had no name in any language Naomi had learned. She turned her head as far as she could, and she held her daughter's weight against her face, and she was still there, holding it, when the door opened 6 hours later, and Damien Rossetti stepped inside the recovery room and stopped when he saw the two of them. He stopped. He did not move further. And in his eyes, in that first unguarded moment before he had time to compose anything, Naomi saw something she had not expected to see. Not the man who had laughed in the study with her sister, not the mafia king who had built his empire on controlled force, not the husband who had lied to her face with perfect ease. She saw a man who was meeting his daughter for the first time from across a room he did not have permission to enter, and who was not demanding permission, who was simply standing in the doorway and waiting. She looked at him for a long moment, her daughter warm and breathing against her chest, the monitor steady, the February light coming gray and thin through the hospital window. And she said nothing, and she did not tell him to leave, and he did not come further into the room. And between them the silence held every version of everything that had brought them here, and every version of everything that had not yet been decided, and it held all of it without breaking. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Naomi did not tell him to come in. She did not tell him to leave. She held Liana against her chest and watched him stand there in the gray February light, and she let the silence be what it was. Not a weapon, not a concession, just the accurate reflection of a situation that did not have a clean answer and was not going to pretend to. Liana made a small sound. Not a cry. Something less formed than that. The involuntary vocalizations of a body, still learning that it was separate from the only world it had ever known. Her eyes were closed. Her fingers curled against Naomi's hospital gown were the size of things Naomi didn't have a comparison for, smaller than she had expected, more perfect than she had prepared herself to handle. Damien's eyes were on the baby. Naomi watched him watch her. She watched the thing that moved across his face. Not the composed authority, not the controlled force, but something underneath all of it, something that had apparently been there the whole time beneath the empire and the lies, and the man who had laughed in the study. Something that looked, from this distance, uncomfortably like the person she had believed he was when she married him. She was too tired and too raw and too medicated to know what to do with that. "You can come in," she said finally. "Sit in the chair. Don't touch her yet." He crossed the room. He sat. He did not touch the baby. He sat in the chair beside the bed and he looked at his daughter. At Liana, 5 pounds 2 ounces, dark-haired, furious, already the most opinionated person in the room, despite having been alive for approximately 6 hours. And he was quiet in a way that Damien Rossetti had almost never been quiet in all the years she had known him. Not the quiet of a man holding something back. The quiet of a man who has arrived somewhere he doesn't have words for yet. "She has your mouth," he said eventually. Naomi looked down at Liana. "She has her own mouth," she said. "She just got here." He almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive. It started, and then something stopped it. Some awareness of where they were and what it would mean to smile right now, what liberties that implied. But it was there for a moment at the corner of his mouth before it went away. They sat like that for a while. The monitor beeped. The heating system in the room made a low, steady sound. Outside the window, Montreal was beginning to go about its morning. She could hear very faintly the sounds of a city that had no awareness of or interest in anything that was happening in this room. "I need you to leave today," she said. He looked up from the baby. "Not forever," she said, before he could say anything. "But today. I need today without you in this building," she paused. "I need to figure out what I'm doing before I can figure out what we're doing. And I cannot do that with you sitting in that chair." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it." He looked back at Liana. Before I go, can I hold her?" She looked at him. At the hands that were resting on his knees, the same hands that had pressed flat on her stomach in the dark, that had folded documents with precise edges, that had done things she had chosen not to know too much about, and other things she had watched and admired and trusted. She looked at them. "Sit on the edge of the bed," she said. "Support her head." He moved carefully, more carefully than she had ever seen him move, as if he were transporting something irreplaceable, which he was. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she transferred Liana into his arms with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a career handling fragile things, and she watched him receive his daughter. He held her the way people held babies when they had never held one before, stiffly at first, with an excess of deliberate attention. And then, within about 30 seconds, something in his body understood what it was holding, and the stiffness went away and he settled. And Liana, who had been beginning to work herself toward an opinion about this new person, made a small recalibrating sound and went quiet. Damien looked down at her. He did not say anything for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He didn't blink it away or look somewhere else. He looked directly at Naomi with wet eyes, and the expression of a man who is not going to insult the moment by pretending to be someone who isn't destroyed by it. I know, he said. "I know what I did. I know what I cost us." "Don't," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to know that I know." She looked at him. "I know you know," she said. "That's not the hard part." He waited. "The hard part," she said, "is that knowing doesn't fix anything. Knowing doesn't give me back the night I stood in that hallway. It doesn't give Liana back the start she should have had." She kept her voice level. She was not going to cry in front of him, not because she was ashamed of crying, but because her tears for this were her own, and she had already spent them, privately, at 4 a.m. in rooms he didn't know about, and she was not going to spend them again here. "You knowing, Damien? That's the beginning of something for you. It's not the beginning of anything for me." He absorbed this. He looked back down at Liana. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Right now? To leave." "After right now." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need time to know." He nodded. He looked at his daughter for another long moment, memorizing, she thought, the specific way she looked right now, the first hours of her face. And then he transferred her back to Naomi with the same careful deliberateness. He stood. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. "I'll be in Montreal," he said. "Not at this hospital, not anywhere near you unless you ask. But I'm not going back without—" He stopped, corrected. "I'll be here, if you need anything." He left. Naomi held Liana and listened to his footsteps go down the corridor, and she pressed her lips against the top of her daughter's head, and she breathed in the specific, unrepeatable smell of a brand new person, and she stayed there, in that breath, for as long as she needed to. 3 days later, Elias came to Montreal. He arrived at the hospital with a paper bag from a bakery near his hotel, and the slightly guilty expression of a man who knows he is bringing pastry to a situation that does not have a pastry solution, but has decided to bring it anyway. He sat in the chair Damien had sat in, and he didn't mention that detail, even though she was fairly certain he knew, because Elias was perceptive, and also had the decency to understand that some things were not his to name. He held Liana for 20 minutes, while Naomi ate a croissant with the focused attention of someone who had not been eating properly for days and was aware of it. "She found you," he said, looking at the baby. Not an accusation, just the fact of it. "He found me," she corrected. She didn't go anywhere. How are you? About that. I'm working on it. She brushed crumbs off the blanket. Elias. The Maya Brooks identity. What's the status? He looked up. You want to keep it. I want to understand what my options are. He was quiet for a moment, settling Liana more securely against his arm with the careful competence of a man who had clearly held babies before. The identity is intact. The Brennan Center records are clean. Westbridge is no longer a viable data source for anyone because we closed that intake file 6 weeks ago. He paused. The marriage certificate is still accessible under the buried layer the way you asked. The Naomi Carter identity is technically an administrative closure, but it's recoverable with the right access, which means you could, if you chose to, restore it. The court system would require a process, but it's not complicated. And Damien's search infrastructure? Dissolved as of about 48 hours ago, Elias said. He terminated all of the PI contracts. The shell companies he'd been using to track down the Montreal lead were closed. He looked at her. He did that himself, before you asked him to. She absorbed this. He's trying, Elias said carefully. Not advocating, just reporting. I know he is, she said. Trying isn't the same as changed. No, Elias agreed. It isn't. She looked at her daughter in his arms, at Liana, who was awake now and conducting a very serious examination of Elias's face with the concentrated intensity of someone who takes data collection seriously, which made Naomi think, yes, that's mine. And she thought about what Elias had said. Trying isn't the same as changed. The question she had been sitting with for 3 days, the one she had been turning over in the small hours while the baby slept and the hospital made its nighttime sounds, was not whether Damien had changed. She couldn't know that. No one could know that about another person from the outside. She had learned that lesson with a specificity that would never leave her. The question was different. The question was, what did Liana deserve? Not what did Naomi deserve? Not what did Damien deserve? Not what would be most satisfying or most just or most punishing in the long accounting of everything that had happened. What did this child, but 5 days old, already opinionated, already hers in a way nothing else had ever been, what did she deserve from the people who had made her? She did not have a clean answer. She had a direction. 2 weeks after Liana was born, on a Tuesday afternoon with weak winter sun coming through the hospital window, Naomi was cleared for discharge. She had a bassinet in the studio apartment at the Brennan Center, where Denise the nurse had organized the other researchers into a quiet, non-intrusive support network that expressed itself as covered dishes left outside her door and a rotating schedule of someone available if she needed anything, offered once and not repeated, which was exactly the right way to help someone who didn't want to need help. On the day she left the hospital, Damien was waiting outside, not at the entrance, down the block, standing beside a car she didn't recognize, not looking toward the hospital doors but looking at the street. He knew she could see him. He was not pretending he wasn't there. He was also not approaching. She stopped on the sidewalk with Liana in the car seat carrier, Elias beside her carrying the bag. She looked at Damien down the block. He looked back. He raised one hand. Not a wave, not a summoning gesture, just an acknowledgement. I see you. I'm here. I'm not coming closer unless you say. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Elias. Give me a minute, she said. Elias took the car seat carrier without a word and went to get his car from the lot. She walked down the block. Damien did not move toward her. He waited until she had closed the distance herself, and she understood that this was deliberate, that he had thought about it, and she filed it without comment. You look better, he said when she was close enough. I feel better, she said. Where are you staying? Hotel near the university. How long? He held her eyes. As long as you're here. She nodded slowly. She looked at the car. The unremarkable rental, nothing like the vehicles he had moved through the world in for the past 15 years. She looked at the coat, the face, the hands at his sides. She looked for the empire in him, the specific carriage of a man who owned things and knew it, and found that it had receded. Not gone, maybe, but receded to a distance she couldn't immediately measure. Liana needs a father, she said, not a king, not someone with a network and an organization and a fleet of cars and 12 men in a room, a father, someone who shows up, someone who is boring and present and there for the 4 a.m. things and the school things, and the bad days. She paused. I don't know if you know how to be that person. I don't know either, he said. She had expected a different answer. The old Damien would have said, I can be anything you need, would have said it smoothly and with full conviction, and would have meant it as a form of authority. The authority of a man who bends situations to his will. This answer was different. This answer was honest, which was the thing the old answer never quite managed to be. We're going to stay in Montreal for a while, she said. I have a position at the Brennan Center that runs through the fall. After that, I don't know. She looked at him steadily. I'm not making any decisions about us, about what we are, or what we're going to be. I'm not capable of making those decisions right now, and I'm not going to make them just because you're standing in front of me. I'm not asking you to, he said. You can see her, she said. Scheduled, agreed in advance, nothing unilateral, nothing that surprises me, nothing that disrupts her routine. She's 2 weeks old and her routine is the most important thing in her world right now. She paused. You show up when you say you're going to show up. You leave when the time is up. You don't use her as a way to get to me. Understood, he said. And Camille. She said the name flat and level, the way she said the names of conditions she was managing. If Camille contacts you about Liana, about anything related to me or my daughter, you tell me immediately and you shut it down. Something moved in his face at the mention of Camille. Not guilt, or not only guilt. Something more complicated, the expression of a man who has had months to sit with the full architecture of what he did, and has arrived at a place beyond simple guilt into something heavier and harder to name. She contacted me in December, he said. Naomi waited. She wanted to know if I'd found you. She wanted... He stopped. His jaw moved. She told me that she was pregnant. The February air was very cold. Naomi stood in it and felt the specific quality of a shock that arrives in a body that is already exhausted, that has no room for more but receives it anyway, because reality does not check your capacity before it delivers. Is it yours? She said. Her voice was perfectly even. She says so. Is it? A pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer, and then, I don't know. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he did not look away, long enough that she had time to feel every single thing that this information stirred up in her body, and then set each thing down, deliberately, the way you set instruments down at the end of a procedure, not throwing them, not pretending you don't feel their weight, just placing them. Does she know where I am? She said. No, I didn't tell her. I shut the conversation down, and I haven't spoken to her since. You need a paternity test, Naomi said. I know. You do that quietly. You do that without involving me or my daughter in any capacity until there is a confirmed result. And if the result is what she says it is, she stopped, breathed. Then you deal with that, whatever that means. You deal with it with whatever version of a conscience you have left, and you do not bring it to my door until I tell you I'm ready to hear it. He nodded. Go, she said. He went. She stood on the sidewalk alone for a moment and watched him get in the car and drive away. And she thought about her sister, about Camille at 26, who had always wanted what Naomi had, who had finally taken it and was now sitting with the consequences of that, carrying a possible child by a man who had left her the moment his wife disappeared. She thought about the particular kind of loneliness that ambition led you to, when what you'd wanted was not actually the thing itself, but only the proof that you could take it. She did not feel sorry for Camille. She did not feel triumphant either. She felt strangely and against all expectation, almost nothing, just the cold air and the sound of the city and the fact of Elias pulling up to the curb with her daughter in the back seat, and the understanding that the story she had been living inside for 7 years had just produced its last surprise, and that whatever came next was something she was going to have to build from material she hadn't used before. She got in the car. The months that followed were not a recovery so much as a construction. She did not rebuild what had been. She built something that had never existed, something that had no template, no precedent in her own life, nothing she could look at and say like that, I want it like that. She built it piece by piece from what she knew to be true, which was not very much but was enough to start with. She knew that Liana needed consistency. She provided it. The same rhythms, the same sounds, the same voice saying the same things at the same times, until the baby's body understood that the world was predictable, and that predictable meant safe. She knew that she needed to sleep, and she did, in the broken, assembled way of new mothers everywhere, catching it in fragments and learning to function on the sum of its parts. She knew that work kept her mind from turning itself against her, so she worked. Maya Brooks's research continued, papers accumulating under a name that was hers now in a way it hadn't been when she first assumed it, because identity was not the file in the system, but the life you built inside it. Damien came on Tuesdays and Saturdays. He arrived at the time he said he would arrive. He left at the time he said he would leave. He did not, in those first months, try to talk about anything except Liana, her development, her sounds, the way she had begun to track faces with the focused attention of someone who takes inventory seriously. He changed diapers. He sat on the floor of the studio apartment with the baby on a playmat and did the things that babies required, which were repetitive and unglamorous and demanded nothing of a man except his presence and his patience. He showed up. Every Tuesday. Every Saturday. He showed up. In April, Naomi came home from the Brennan Center at 6 in the evening to find Damien sitting in the hallway outside her apartment door with Liana asleep against his chest, one of his large hands spread across her back, her face turned into his neck. The neighbor who sometimes watched the baby during Naomi's late hours had let him in, and he had taken over from her and had apparently been sitting there for 40 minutes because Liana had fallen asleep. And he had not moved, was not going to move because she was asleep, and he was not going to be the thing that woke her. Naomi stood in the corridor and looked at them. She stood there long enough that Damien looked up and met her eyes, and the look on his face was not a plea, and not an argument, and not anything that asked for anything. It was just a man sitting on the floor of a hallway with his sleeping daughter, and the slightly uncomfortable posture of someone who had been not moving for 40 minutes for a very small person's sake. She unlocked the door. He carried Liana inside and put her in the bassinet without waking her, with a carefulness that would have, a year ago, seemed impossible in a man who had moved through the world the way he had. Naomi made tea. She made 2 cups without thinking about it, which she noticed after the fact and filed without comment. They sat at the small table, the only table, the studio was not large, and they drank their tea in the particular silence that had been developing between them over the past 2 months, which was different from all the silences that had come before it. Not the comfortable silence of familiarity, not the strategic silence of people managing each other, not the terrible silence of the night she had lain in the dark beside him and known what she knew. Something in between all of those, something that did not yet have a name. "The paternity test," she said. He set his cup down. "Negative." She absorbed this. "Does she know?" "Yes." "How did she take it?" "Like Camille takes everything she doesn't want to hear." He paused. "She's angry. She'll be angry for a while. Eventually, she'll find something else to want." Naomi thought about her sister, about the girl who had painted her nails the same colors as Naomi's and cut her hair the same way and had stood in Naomi's kitchen wearing Naomi's dress and looked at Naomi's husband with that particular hunger. She thought about what it meant to spend your life wanting the shape of someone else's existence without understanding what that shape cost. "I'm not going to contact her," Naomi said. "Not now, maybe not ever. That's not a punishment. I'm just done." She looked at her tea. "Some things you survive by leaving them behind. Not because you hate them, because staying near them keeps tearing the wound." He didn't try to argue with this. He nodded once. "And the empire," she said. "Gone," he said. Not with grief, which surprised her. Not with performed indifference either, which would have been suspicious. With the factual tone of someone reporting a thing that has been processed. "The enforcement structure dissolved when I stopped enforcing. The financial network was absorbed by entities that had been waiting for the opening. There were some confrontations." He paused. "I'm still here." "The kidney," she said. He looked at her. She had found out in March, Elias had told her, because Elias knew everything eventually, and because he had decided, correctly, that this was something she needed to know. The kidney Damien had donated to a soldier 8 years ago. The one remaining kidney now showing the early markers of failure, the result of years of damage from a lifestyle that had not been kind to any system in his body. "How long have you known?" she said. "About the failure specifically? 7 months." He looked at his hands. "I found out 2 weeks before you disappeared." She sat with that for a moment. 2 weeks before she disappeared. 2 weeks during which he had known he was facing kidney failure, had said nothing, had continued the affair, had come home with flowers, and told her he'd been in Milan. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "Because I knew what you'd do," he said. "You'd have gone into physician mode. You'd have handled it. You'd have managed it, and managed me, and put everything else aside." He stopped. "I didn't want to trap you with it." "But you were fine trapping me with everything else," she said quietly. He didn't answer. There was no answer. She looked at him, at the face that was thinner now, at the particular grayness under his skin that she had been noticing for the past month and had been deliberately not naming because she had not been ready to name it. And she felt the weight of what she was about to have to decide, which she had known for 3 weeks was coming and had not yet figured out how to hold. He was her husband. He was Liana's father. He was a man who had betrayed her in a way she had not recovered from and was not sure she would. He was also a man who was sitting at her kitchen table drinking tea he hadn't asked for, who showed up every Tuesday and Saturday without fail, who had sat on a hallway floor for 40 minutes so as not to wake a sleeping infant, who had dissolved an empire without being asked to and had set it without grief. And he needed a kidney. She was a physician. She was a maternal fetal specialist, not a transplant surgeon, but she understood the medicine. She had looked up every study in the past 3 weeks, had run his likely creatinine trajectory in her head at 4 in the morning while the baby slept, had done the thing that doctors did when the patient was someone they couldn't be objective about, which was to become more rigorous, not less. She was a compatible blood type. She had 1 functioning kidney she could spare. She was 34 years old and healthy, and the medical risk to her, managed properly, was acceptable. She had not decided. She had come close to deciding, and then pulled back, because the decision required her to look at something she had been circling for months without going directly at it, which was the question of what she was doing this for. If she donated the kidney, what was she doing it for? Was it for Liana, who needed her father alive? Was it for the version of herself that had loved him honestly and couldn't pretend that love had simply stopped existing? Was it for some abstract principle about what human beings owed each other regardless of what they'd done? Or was it for him? She didn't know yet. She was almost certain she needed to know before she did it. "There are 3 compatible donors in the National Registry," she said. "I've looked." He stared at her. "None of them are ideal matches. 2 are acceptable. 1 is a near-perfect match, 31 years old, no comorbidities, based in Boston." She held his gaze. "You don't need me to do this. You have options." He was very still. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because I want you to understand that if I decide to do it, it's not because you have no choice. It's because I chose it, and I'm telling you that I haven't decided." "Okay," he said. "I need you to get on the national list," she said. "Today. Not next week. Today. And I need you to pursue the Boston match as if I'm not in the picture. You do not wait for me. You do not make my decision for me by making yourself worse. I'll make the call tomorrow." "Today," she said again. He nodded. "Today." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and he did not fill the silence with reassurance or negotiation or any of the things she had once watched him use to manage every room he was in. He just sat there and let her look. "I'm not Naomi Carter anymore," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean that literally, and I mean it in every other way." She set her cup down. "The woman you married, the woman who stayed quiet when she should have spoken, who bent herself into whatever shape the life required, she's gone. I let her go on purpose. I'm not bringing her back. I'm not asking you to. I need to know you understand what that means. It means that whatever this is," she gestured between them, a small, precise gesture that didn't overstate anything. "It starts from here, not from 7 years ago. Not from the good parts that we're both tempted to go back to. Here, February, Montreal, Liana in that bassinet, and both of us at this table. That's the beginning, if there is one." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'll take it," he said. "Whatever you're willing to give." She stood and picked up both cups and brought them to the sink, and she stood at the sink with her back to him. The way she had stood at the kitchen sink in the house she had left, looking at the window, and she thought about the morning light that had come through that window and the way she had let herself feel, for 1 minute, everything she was leaving behind. She thought about what she felt now. What she felt was not the same. It was not that clean, not that defined. It was the complex, unresolved, imperfect feeling of a woman standing at a sink in Montreal who had survived something significant and come out the other side into a life that did not have a blueprint and was going to require her to build it by hand, in real time, from scratch. She dried her hands. She turned around. "I'll walk you out," she said. He stood. He looked at Liana in the bassinet on his way to the door. The look she had seen him give her daughter every Tuesday and Saturday. The specific look of a man who has not yet gotten over the fact of her, who may never get over it. And then he followed Naomi to the door. In the doorway, he stopped. "For what it's worth," he said. She waited. "I know sorry is the smallest word in the world for what I did. I know it doesn't reach the thing it's supposed to reach." He looked at her steadily. "But I am. Every day. I'm sorry every day." She looked at him. "I know you are," she said. And then, because it was true, and because she was done performing emotions she didn't have and suppressing ones she did. Some days that matters more than other days. He nodded. He stepped into the hallway. She closed the door. She stood on her side of it for a moment, one hand flat on the wood, and she listened to his footsteps go down the corridor. The weight slightly heavier on the right foot from an old break that had healed wrong, the details she had absorbed over 7 years without intending to and could not now unlearn. She stood there until she couldn't hear him anymore. Then she went to the bassinet and looked at her daughter. Liana was asleep with the total commitment of the very young, her chest rising and falling in the small, rapid rhythm that still made Naomi's own breath catch every time she watched it. Dark hair. Her own mouth, whatever Damien said. Hands curled at her temples in the sleeping posture that the pediatric literature called the surrender position, and that Naomi had come to think of as the posture of someone who trusts the world to hold them. She reached into the bassinet and put one finger in Liana's palm. The baby's hand closed around it, automatic, certain, the grip of someone who has no doubt. Naomi stood there with her finger in her daughter's hand, and she looked at the window, not at anything outside it, just at the glass and the dark beyond it. And she felt the full weight of everything that had brought her here settle through her body, and then, slowly, like sediment settling in water after a storm, find the bottom. It didn't go away. She was not under the impression it was going to go away. Grief did not go away. Betrayal did not go away. The 7 years and the laugh in the study, and the morning she had stood at a kitchen sink and counted her 12 possessions and decided to cease to exist, none of that was going to go away. But it had found its place. It had weight, and it had a location, and she knew where it lived now, which meant she knew how to move around it. That was not healing, exactly. It was something more durable than healing. It was the knowledge of what she had survived. In the spring, when the Montreal snow began to recede, and Liana had developed a specific and extremely clear opinion about being put down, Naomi made 2 decisions. The first was that she would see the transplant surgeon at St. Luc, not as a donor candidate, not yet, and maybe not ever, and if ever then on a timeline that was entirely her own, but as the physician and partial patient she was, to understand the full picture, to put herself in possession of all the information, because that was what she did. She made decisions from information. She always had. The second was that she would call Elias and ask him to begin the process of restoring the Naomi Carter identity. Not to replace Maya Brooks. She was going to keep that name, at least for now, because the woman who had built a life under it was real and had earned her own continuity. But to restore the record, to make Naomi Carter exist again in the places that mattered, her medical license, her legal standing, the court records that would allow her daughter to carry her own history without ambiguity. She was not going to disappear anymore. She had needed to disappear. She had disappeared with full intention and clear eyes, and she did not regret it. It had saved Liana. It had saved herself. It had created the distance that was the only thing that could have broken the gravity of the life she had been in. She was grateful for every layer of it, for Elias and the prepaid phone and the studio at Westbridge and the flight at 3 in the morning, and every difficult choice that had brought her to this apartment, this bassinet, this small hand wrapped around her finger. But she was not a woman who disappeared. She was a woman who operated in hard conditions and made clear decisions and kept her hand steady when everything around her was failing. She was a woman who had stood in hallways and heard things that would have broken other people and had walked away and made a plan. She was a woman who had built an exit from inside an empire and executed it with a precision that Damien Rossetti himself had recognized because he had trained himself in the same methods, and she had learned them from watching him. And she was a woman who had lain in a hospital bed in Montreal with a dangerous blood pressure and made the call for a cesarean section and signed the consent form with a shaking hand and not flinched. She was Naomi Carter. She was also Maya Brooks. She was both and neither, and someone that neither name yet fully covered. She was Liana's mother. She was, she thought, just beginning to find out what else she was. Outside the Montreal window, the ice on the St. Lawrence was breaking up in the way it did every spring. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but piece by piece and then faster, and then with the accelerating inevitability of a process that had always been going to happen, that the cold had only ever delayed and not prevented. Liana squeezed her finger. Naomi squeezed back. "Okay," she said softly, to her daughter, to the room, to the version of herself that had walked out of a house 40 miles from a city she used to live in, to the future that did not yet have a shape. "Okay, let's go."